Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, I'm just delighted to have as my guests Zara McDonald, president biologist and director of Felidae Conservation Fund, Mitch Friedman, executive director of Conservation Northwest, and Sean Stevens, executive director of WildEarth Guardians out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. So thank you all for coming. I'm so excited to be here to talk about the Earth. The Earth. We're all living here. We need to have a good environment. And you're going to describe, Zara, why it's important for me that big cats are healthy and are sustained and do not all die out because of lack of habitat. So talk with me about why it's important for me as a person living in some location that big cats are healthy, and how are they a marker for a healthy environment?
At Felidae Conservation Fund, our work is rooted in the understanding that wild cats are keystone species, so vital to the health of ecosystems around the world. At Felidae, we protect wild cats and biodiversity through rigorous science, community engagement, and a One Health approach linking wildlife, human, and ecosystem health. Out of the 40 wildcat species globally, all are under threat, and their survival often depends on how well we're addressing challenges like habitat connectivity, human-wildlife conflict, and climate change. Our flagship Bay Area Puma project in California investigates how pumas and bobcats navigate urban edge habitats using camera traps, genetic sampling, and health surveys. We also have education programs and partnerships with landowners that foster coexistence and public safety, all critical today. So our projects span from California to South America to Asia, always with a strategic focus on where our work can have the greatest impact.
So Mitch, let's go to you, Conservation Northwest. Let's say I'm living, not in the Northwest, but I'm living in the Southwest, or I'm living in goodness knows, I'm living someplace in Asia. Why is it important to have a healthy ecosystem for me? Why is it important for me living in Thailand or in France that the American ecosystem, your ecosystem in the Northwest, is a healthy ecosystem?
It's all connected. You wouldn't even ask the question if we were talking about Yellowstone or Yosemite, because people know that. But there's, high profile, great, beautiful places and wild places across the country. Where I work in Washington State and southern British Columbia, our work is to protect enough habitat in large, mainly mountain core areas like the North Cascades and the Olympic Mountains and the South Cascades, but also connections, habitat corridors that link together those large wild areas so that cougars, wolverines, fishers, other large animals can maintain sustainable populations by having, interbreeding between their populations in the core areas. And that's our bread and butter, but we're also deeply involved in recovery of particular carnivores. Washington, until recently, hadn't had gray wolves or wolverines or fishers, which are a large member of the weasel family, or lynx in particular parts of the state. And we've been fundamental to the return of those critters and their safe and successful recovery in particular places.
I'd like to talk with you all a little bit more about this. I just read an article about the impact of deer on forests and on healthy forests. And when deer overpopulation occurs, how you have whole forests becoming unhealthy. And when those populations are controlled, you have healthier forests. But before we do that, Sean, let's take that to a global stage. So you're dealing with an even more abstract and diverse set of objectives. So talk a little bit about Wild Earth Guardians and why it's important to have wild spaces for those of us who live not adjacent to those wild spaces, but who live in urban areas far away from them.
Well, I think Zara and Mitch touched on it. Everything is connected. And when we're thinking about the very unique and amazing and vast American West, we have so many special places, special species, wildlife that only exists in this part of the world. And keeping the whole, keeping it connected so that we are not losing these integral parts of what makes this planet so special. That's what Wild Earth Guardians is about. We work to protect and restore wildlife, wild places, and the health of the American West. And that can zoom into little critters that no one's ever heard of and that you're never going to see, that live in one little neck of the woods that is pretty isolated, to species like Zara and Mitch were talking about, the Mexican wolf, the grizzly, these iconic animals that really make our wild places truly wild. And without them, they would be a little bit sterile and not as interesting and vital as they should be.
Let's talk a little bit about public engagement, because there seems to be this tendency to marginalize and characterize people working on particular issues, right? So in the environmental space, it's all about the granola crunching scientists who are nature lovers, right? Instead of all of us. I would really like to talk about your constituents and who they are and what kind of a cross-section of people they encompass. So Zara, Mitch, Sean, you all have volunteers. You all have board members, you all have funders, you all have staff members. Could you just talk, maybe Mitch, you go first, then Sean, then Zara. Could you just talk a little bit about who comprises your organization?
If I could, Mark, I'd rather talk about who comprises our coalitions.
Okay.
Because that's how we get things done. I'm a big believer in the big tent. I've been working in conservation for about 40 years. And I started out on the radical edge of things, organizing protests and, sitting high up in trees so that they couldn't get cut down. But where I found we have the most success is through tactics and organizing that bring everybody in to find common ground. For instance, a couple months ago, when Congress was considering the reconciliation budget bill, the so-called big, beautiful bill, there was all that controversy about a proposal to sell off millions of acres of public lands. That got killed because of the outrage, not coming just from, tried and true conservationists, but from the hunting community and others who, I've worked with a lot of very conservative constituencies, ranchers on wolf recovery, loggers on forest restoration, and things like that. We have common ground in love of nature and need of clean water. So it's important that we use tactics that don't alienate, but bring people in so that we can regain the breadth of political clout to protect the planet.
You're making a point that I always hold near and dear, that there's not a huge amount that divides us. So if we accentuate those things, we're just doing ourselves a disservice. Sean, are you finding that you can also make common cause with people who are, because Mitch, what you're saying is that you become a convert, right, from your earlier days, and you've basically been informed by people who were on the opposite side of those days until you are now at a point where you're making common cause. Sean, talk a little bit about your experience in that respect as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Mitch is saying is interesting, because there's this poll that gets conducted, I think, annually from Colorado College, and it's a survey of opinions in the West about public lands and wildlife. And what you find in this poll is, even in places that we might consider to be more conservative and less inclined to support conservation of land and wildlife, that, as you've said, Mark, these values are very broadly held. People support wildlife conservation. They support the Endangered Species Act. I'm talking 75, 80, 85% of people across the West and cutting across partisan lines. And so I think that tapping into that intrinsic support that is there for wild places and wild animals is the job of our organizations. And I do think it has become pretty challenging because the expression of those viewpoints, though broadly held, has kind of been titrated down into camps. And we have, a conservative party that is mostly not interested in doing that work, and a party on the left that is sometimes interested in doing that work. And I think what Mitch is getting at in terms of collaboration and the ability to find that common ground is important. I also think that the agitation and stretching the conversation so that, people are out there showcasing that these are commonly held values and getting us to pay attention more to those commonly held values. I think it's kind of that it takes all kinds, it takes all stripes to elevate the work that we're doing, because we have a crowded world of opinions, and not everyone's focused on wildlife and conservation. They've got their top 10 issues that are probably closer to Maslow's hierarchy. So, I think that's our job, is to break through that a little bit and showcase how important wildlife and land conservation is.
So Zara, when you're trying to get people involved, what is your, well, let's use a sales term. What is your pitch to somebody who lives in a particular area that might be adjacent to some of the large cats that you're trying to preserve? What is your essential value proposition that would cause me to invest in your activities, either time or money?
It's tricky on one hand because, community engagement is central to our work. So we work with community groups throughout California and the public, and we need the public to foster awareness and action. However, sometimes in these urban edge environments, not in my backyard actually is something that we run into a lot, which when we have a predator in an urban landscape that we are collecting data on and, informing the public with science-based awareness information, we run up against some challenges with in communities where families have kids. There are increased sightings in particular hotspot areas where habitat is particularly good. And so we're constantly navigating those sort of varying types, or that range of resident in California in particular. We are incredibly fortunate in the fact that we have probably weekly 20 to 30 inquiries coming in for interest in volunteering, offering pro bono support, very passionate individuals who care incredibly about the wildlife species that are native to us and preserving them and understanding the role they play in the process and why they're important and why pumas in our backyard actually reduce disease in the system and keep prey species in check. There's so many sort of simple conservation messages that we need to reach more people with so that there's greater understanding. But we will always have challenges with certain ranch owners and or livestock managers, ranchette owners that maybe aren't quite there yet.
Well, I mean, just when you take a look at tick-borne illnesses, right, where that are being carried by large and small mammals, and if the predators are gone, then those mammals proliferate, and those diseases eventually get into our food supply and they affect human beings. But it's a very difficult argument to make. I would say there's an analogous argument about the wolf population, particularly for people who are raising livestock, right, Mitch?
Yes, but there's things we can do about that. Wolf recovery is not a matter of providing ideal habitat. Wolves are generalists. They can live in all sorts of habitat and they breed really well. So wolves are going to be fine if we're not directly persecuting, poisoning, trapping, shooting them. So wolf recovery is all about promoting coexistence, giving and helping ranchers with the tools that minimize the risk of wolf depredations. It's fancy cowboys, range riders, and other tools like that that have allowed Washington to have a more successful wolf recovery, where a much smaller percentage of the wolf population is killed each year than in other wolf states, because we don't have nearly as much conflict because of the level of our investment, making it work for everyone. The ranchers may not want wolves, but if we in the city who do want wolves pay our taxes, pay our donations, show some empathy, bridge that cultural divide, and respect one another, we have a better chance of it working.
That it strikes me that what you all are saying, and Sean, I'd love for you to comment on this, is that there is an educational piece, but the education piece is bidirectional, right? So the people who are most impacted, whether they are wild adjacent individuals where there's some urban encroachment or residential encroachment on wild areas, or it's learning from ranchers and farmers about their concerns, or learning from scientists about what makes for a good wildlife corridor or habitat, right? There's that information exchange, but there's also this issue of, if we want it, are we willing to pay for it, right, Sean? I mean, that's, a lot of this is about where we invest. And do we want to invest in an America that also has wild areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true in terms of some of the localized impacts that wildlife can have. But I think you got to rewind a few generations to put that in perspective also, because it wasn't that long ago that there was a different way of living with, coexisting with wildlife on this continent. And we, over the last 150 years, have really gotten used to a sanitized environment, where we were, thinking about what was best for humans and really what was best for making money. And I think that that's a big rethink for us here in the United States, to find a place on the landscape in our hearts for these species that we share the planet with. And that's not easy. And I think Mitch has described one pathway for that, which is really recognizing and having empathy for the local impacts. And I think another pathway, are these legal tools. The Endangered Species Act was put on the books over 50 years ago, and it was our nation's commitment to not intentionally driving species to extinction. And there's still broad support for that, but it's a tool that is now kind of on a knife's edge a little bit in Congress, and has been under attack for many years. And so I think part of the future for wildlife conservation is continuing to do the education work, the work to promote coexistence and fund coexistence, but also that narrative work that is about rewiring some of how we think about wildlife, so that we are really coming from a place of, we're not the only species on this planet, and we got to learn how to share better.
How do we deal with this issue of alienation? This has happened in the environmental movement for generations. The environmental movement, the history of the environmental movement basically excluded the interests of Native American peoples who have their own individualized take on what is right and proper and how nature functions, coming out of their traditions. You have people from diverse ethnic backgrounds. You have the urban land divide. You have the farmer or rancher versus urban divide. How do we bring people together? Because it seems to me, as Mitch was saying, look, with reference to his own history of looking at this as a zero-sum game where there were going to be people who were going to be the opposers and the enemies, right? And then maturing, Mitch, I'm hoping I'm not putting words into your mouth, to this place where you're working with counterparts to create solutions, which Zara, Sean, you seem to be on that same track. How do we get to the point where those discussions are more routine?
Well, one thing that we found to be successful is our citizen science platforms, and they invite communities to document and learn about the wildlife in their own neighborhoods. So education is not just about information, it's about empowering people to coexist with wildlife and become those active stewards of their environment. So this has been a success story for us.
Well, that's interesting. So what you're also saying is that you're not necessarily anymore, as a scientist with a particular discipline, functioning in a way that other people could take as a token of disrespect for how they think, who they are, what they can contribute. You're now beginning to break down, if I understand you correctly, you're welcoming that contribution and working in a collegial way with somebody who might be not have the same education. Am I getting this right, Zara?
Yeah, correct. They play a role in this picture, and it's a fundamental one. It's, success is often steady, incremental progress, and we see that with these citizen science programs. We see newfound excitement, and once people learn about what is out in their backyards, literally, they become excited, and we do see hearts and minds change.
Sean, are you doing the same thing in your area? Are you trying to engage people in productive conversations? They might not have the same background you do, but they might have interests that intersect with yours. Are you identifying those people and then bringing them into that tent?
I think it really depends on the location, the situation, the context. We work in Montana and on grizzly work where there's a lot of controversy around grizzly and wolf recovery in the Northern Rockies, and trying to find those opportunities for coexistence. Sometimes it can be few and far between, and it can be really challenging even to draw people out and make them feel like they're on an island from their own community that is more staunchly opposed to the recovery of these predators. We're definitely doing coexistence work there down in New Mexico in the Gila, grazing permit buyout work. So recognizing that the aridification of the area is making public lands grazing a not very long-term prospect, and trying to figure out if there's a way to reach agreement with folks who are grazing on public lands, who are looking to get out, to help them have a financial runway to do that. But I also think, as I said earlier, there is a different and a very important role for organizations like WildEarth Guardians and others to also be kind of planting that flag and saying that these species have value, even if we can't identify the financial incentive for how to get along. And sometimes you need a little bit of that backbone to actually create some sideboards around what's going to be allowed, activities that are going to harm or not harm species. But I would say also to provide a platform for some of this collaboration work to even be able to have a starting point. If we didn't have some of those laws coming online in the 60s and 70s that started to protect the environment from here, I've got a law to point to, I can take you to court. I think we would have had a harder time even getting to a place where we could get this big capitalist system to kind of turn and pivot to think about something different than just the exploitation path that we were on.
It just reminds me, if you go back to biblical times, could you imagine what it was like for the original writers of the laws that are in the Old Testament to go to farmers and say, I'm sorry, you should really allow your fields to go unplanted every certain number of years? Could you imagine what that was like? So what you're saying is we can go back to biblical times and go and talk with people about their overgrazed lands and say, maybe we should behave differently. But you have to start off with a conversation, don't you, Sean?
Mark, I wouldn't claim to be the biblical scholar, but I think that's a pretty interesting parallel to modern times. Again, human restraint. What we can do what we should do. And I think those are the conversations that are really fundamental to the work to protect public lands and wildlife.
And it has to be done with assent, right, Mitch? I mean, the fact is that you can pass a law and there will always be somebody that doesn't like that particular law, but it has to have the general embrace. If you don't, then over time, if that embrace erodes, you start having the law attacked.
I think the key thing is polarization. There are a lot of incentives to polarize for activists. If you send out a fundraising appeal that demonizes the other side, you're going to make a lot of money. If you give sound bites that are polarizing, demonizing the other side, you're more likely to get quoted because newspapers need those clicks. And that stuff's toxic. I'm a biologist. I'm trained as a scientist. And I've done my share of believing I had better access to the truth and believing that my tactics were going to, drive the conversation. But over the years, I've been really lucky to have some extraordinary successes. I've protected some big landscapes. I've helped return some controversial and charismatic species. And what I think works best is avoiding polarization, giving common ground a chance, and listening. Because even those farmers, and you mentioned Native Americans, Mark, I've done a lot of work with Indian tribes and First Nations in Canada. Their views on these things are not always what we would project onto them. So there's a lot of listening to be done to find where our interests coincide rather than entering with our defiant positions.
Before we got onto camera to start recording this, we were talking about listening to elders and listening to the wisdom there. The fact is that there's so many threads of knowledge that are not isolated into little academic categories. That it's all well and good to be academically oriented and to learn things from those threads, but you really hazard making some really stupid mistakes if you don't start listening to the common sense of your neighbors, right, Zara? Of the people who have the experience, right, Sean? Of the individuals whose livestock might be impacted by the proximity of wolves, right, Mitch? I mean, if you can end up with a collaboration amongst us all, we're likely to end up with a much better, more solid, more sustainable future.
There's a lot of short-term thinking in the activist movement because we enter it when we're young and hungry and angry and desperate. It's the end of the world. We only have 10 years left to save the world from the climate or biodiversity crisis. But here we are. We're still here. And shouting fire in the fire theater doesn't get the fire dealt with any quicker. So yeah, I think we need to be doing things in a more deliberate way that brings people in, and the solutions are not always what they appear when we start working on something.
Zara, why don't you give us a last word, and then Sean? And so if there was one thing that I could do, that we could all do, aside from writing checks, which of course we can all do, but if there's one thing that we can do in terms of behaviors, education that we could take or promulgate, what should that be?
Well, of course, this kind of long-term science-based work requires sustainable funding. And that's where the community plays a vital role. So people, of course, can support our works by donating, volunteering, sharing our work, and adopting coexistence practices in their own backyards. I mean, it's essential really for moving forward. It's about protecting the balance of nature itself. And by focusing on connectivity, reducing human-wildlife conflict, advancing science-driven conservation, we're ensuring that these species and the ecosystems they sustain can thrive for generations to come. That is the challenge.
John, what's your answer to that same question? What is the one thing that I should be doing this week?
Well, I think the great thing about our collective organizations is, we have professional staff who are going out there every day doing that hard work in lots of different ways to protect species and places. And it's something I alluded to earlier. There's broad support for what we're working on across the population. But I think the intensity of that support is the challenge and communicating that to decision makers. So I think the thing that I always encourage people to do is if you care about these issues, you need to be a little bit of an evangelist about it. And you need to go to your community, you need to go to your church, your neighbors, your workplace, and start bringing other people along who probably care about it too, but are not necessarily understanding the ways that they can plug in and make a difference. And, build that community around yourself if you care about these things and make your voice louder by doing that.
Yeah, my answer is talk with somebody else and perhaps go and enjoy some wild spaces outside with those people. It's really important that we not just talk to the true believers or people who are already on our side. It's really important that we make friends. It's really important that we listen. That's where we're going to change the world, by doing it together. I'd like to thank you all for this wonderful, wonderful discussion on conservation. Zara McDonald, President Biologist, Director of Felidae Conservation Fund, Mitch Friedman, Executive Director of the Conservation Northwest, and Sean Stevens, Executive Director of WildEarth Guardians. I'd like to thank you all. Please thank your staffs. Please thank your funders. Please thank your board members. Please thank your volunteers. This has just been wonderful. And thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.